mile in your neighbor's shoes. Walk a mile, walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. Walk a mile, walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. You'll understand them better if you do. Walk a mile, walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. Walk a mile, walk a mile in your
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's really exciting to be able to meet some other people in the community and get a chance to share some of what I love about Judaism. The topic here, Judaism today, is broad, probably, is the best way to say it. I'm going to try and go back through history and give us about 4,000 years worth of history in the next 20 minutes or so. And I'll try and hit the high points. I'm not, although I know the dates relatively specifically, I had to know them to get through school. I'm big on nice round numbers. I like round numbers, and I think they're easier for us to understand and contextualize the vastness of history. One of the things to understand about Judaism, first of all, is it's a very old religion. It's one of the oldest, it's certainly the oldest Western religion around, and one of the oldest that's still being practiced today throughout the globe. Now, there's a few Eastern religions that probably match in terms of age, but we go back at least, verifiably at least 3,000 years, and if we want to go back as far as tradition tells us, 4,300 years or so from today is the very start of Judaism, if we want to date from where we speculate Abraham and Sarah really existed in the timeline. Now, that's an interesting question, too, because there's verifiable history, and then there's anecdotal history in a lot of ways, and there's allegory. In terms of verifiable history, we can date pretty far back to around the year 1000 before the Common Era, and when I do dating, AD and BC are Christian concepts, and so we tend to date Common Era, everything from the year 0 forward, and before the Common Era, everything previously to it, but the dates sort of line up. What I say is 1000 BCE, you would say was 1000 BCE, or BC, right, before Christ, before the Common Era. About the year 1000, we can go back that far. There's archaeological evidence. There is outside stories, not just what we find in the Bible itself about the history of the time period, that can say, yes, there was a city of David, there was a King David, there was a conquest of Canaan that happens, and it takes place around the year 1000. That's a nice round number to remember. So we can be sure that there was a form of Judaism, the Judaism of the Bible, that's at least 3,000 years old, which still makes it one of the oldest religions around. From there, we run into sort of speculation based on what the stories in the Bible tell us. Moses brings everybody out of Egypt. There were 400 years of slavery in Egypt, so that puts us back to the 1500 BCE. Then you've got to go through a few generations backwards from Joseph to Jacob to Isaac to Abraham, and you might end up somewhere around the year 2000, where we can date maybe 4,000 years. But a lot of that is relatively speculatory, and for a liberal Jew like myself, who doesn't buy the story as a literal truth, then I can say these are stories that were important to my ancestors and that form the foundation of a religion that I hold dear to my heart today. But it doesn't have to be literal truth for me to follow the stories and find them meaningful. I mean, I think there's a big difference there between what Orthodox or very traditional, strict Judaism would say and still wants to teach today, and where we've come as a modern religion that wants to bring everything into account in our world and figure out a way to reconcile both science and faith and live in the modern world. So I'll come back around to that. That's hopefully where we're going to end. But the beginning of Judaism, what you have to understand is the Judaism of what we would call the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the original Bible, The Judaism of the Torah is a very different religion from the Judaism that's practiced today among all the streams of Judaism. For a number of major reasons, but the big one being the lack of a temple in Jerusalem. That the original religion of Judaism, the Judaism of the Bible, was a sacrificial cult. It centered around one central temple in Jerusalem where there was a priestly class that oversaw sacrifices made to God by the people. And the sacrifices could be any number of things. Sometimes they were animals, sometimes it was the first fruits of your harvest, or the grains, some sort of monetary donation, depending on what your business was, but you gave something of yourself at the temple that was your method of approaching or connecting with the divine. And this was the earliest religion. And even the word for sacrifice in Hebrew, the word korban, denotes that. It means to draw near or to approach something. So the korban the sacrifice was a way to draw near, to feel God. And it was wholly in the realm of the priestly class. There was no other way into it. It was a hereditary portion. You had to be born into the priestly class within the Israelite community. And if you had the right genetics, you could then be the high priest and you would oversaw everything that happened in the temple. The Israelite community then had to make the temple a central part of their life, and there were a number of ways that they did that. And 3 times a year there were pilgrimage festivals, Passover being one of them. Obviously we don't celebrate Passover that way today. I'll talk about how. But Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, 3 times a year you took whatever it was from your harvest. Sometimes it was an animal from, if you raised animals, sometimes it was the fruit from your trees, so that you could say, be thankful to God. And there were a lot of other reasons. Sometimes if you did something wrong, you'd bring a different offering to absolve yourself of guilt. If you were looking to get married and have a family, you'd bring a different offering for fertility or for long life. And then you can understand there's a lot of the pagan, you can hear it in the way that I'm describing it, right? Instead of having a separate God for each one of the things you wanted to happen in your life, it all happened in one central place. And this was the idea of monotheism, which was one of the core changes that Judaism brings to the area. There's no longer little gods. There's one divine power over and above everything, and that we're deluding ourselves not to be able to see it as such, this divine entity that we should all be worshiping in some way in the Jewish world. So this was Judaism of the Torah, and this lasted for about 1,000 years through the first temple period, which was the first round of kings in the ancient world. A small exile in Babylon when the Assyrians came through and basically assimilated the entirety of the northern Israelite community, leaving only one tribe left, the tribe of Judah, which is where Judaism really comes from today. That then returns to the land of Canaan about 50 years later, builds a second temple that exists from around the year 500 before the Common Era up until it's destroyed in the year 70, almost 600 years of this one kind of cult, in which there was always a Jewish sort of head governor of the realm of the area, but they were always paying tribute back to some larger entity. The Greeks held it for a long time, and then the Romans held the land for a long time, and the Jews were sort of just another one of the groups in and amongst this larger empire. But they were allowed to maintain their temple as long as they maintained order. And the Jews would still bring their sacrifices to the priests, and the priests would absolve them whatever needed to happen, and then they lived their lives the best that they could. This all starts to change. So the first shift that Judaism really brings to the world is this concept of monotheism, and it changes the religion and the culture in there very significantly. The second shift here happens, though, as we move away from this idea of sacrificial worship into a totally new religion. And a lot of this happens because of outside forces. The Romans become increasingly upset with the population in the land around them, not just the Jews, but there were other groups that were uprising too, but the Jews in particular had a lot of problems, not only within its own community, but with the Romans outside of the community, and even Jesus was part of this milieu that was happening here. And there was a big fight between 2 main groups of Jews. One were known as the Sadducees and the others the Pharisees, but you can think of them as the priests, the Sadducees, who wanted to maintain the status quo the way it was, and the rabbis, a wholly new group of Jew. This idea or concept of a rabbi that didn't exist before. A learned person. It wasn't a hereditary portion. You weren't born into the rabbinate. You could study and learn. Anybody had the right to become one. It took a knowledge of Torah, of the Bible. And the whole argument the rabbis were making was that God's been revealed to us. God was revealed in the Bible, in the 5 books of Moses. This was the revelation of the divine. We can know God through study and deed, through observing, through studying the Word of God and then acting on those words, existing in the world to better the world in the way that this revealed God wanted. This was what the rabbis were arguing for early on. There was corruption among the priestly class and in the temple, I'm sure. You've heard about that. This hereditary, this solidification of power through a hereditary line was very exclusionary. And it left a lot of people feeling like they had no power or no control over their lives or in their religion. And so this rabbinic group was working to change that. And so a lot of things were happening here. They were moving away from sacrifice. The synagogue becomes a central gathering place as opposed to the temple for people to come study and find community and find fellowship. And the temple becomes less, I won't say less important, it was still central because there was no other way to approach God according to the ancient world. This changes when the Romans finally get so fed up with the local community that they literally destroy the second temple, blow it. This whole stone, big structure, artifice that was built over 100 years, they destroy it from end to end, almost blow it up, burn it to the ground. If you can imagine stone burning in such a way, how angry the Romans had to have been with the group to want to make that happen. The destruction of the temple meant the end of Judaism, or should have in a lot of ways, because the priests had so solidified their power base solely to the temple. The only place you could practice and perform Judaism, and it was written in the Bible that way, was the temple in Jerusalem. Without it, there was nothing left. Except the rabbis were already starting to move us away from that early on. And they basically are kicked in the butt to do it and finish it because there's no other option. Judaism either dies out or it moderates, it changes. And along with this change comes a number of really fundamental tenets of Judaism beyond just monotheism and this idea of one God, but this idea that God is unknowable to us in this world. And most importantly, this idea there's almost nothing that we can do that God needs. So anything that we do to connect to God is really for us and our own benefits. Because if God is this omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being in the outer world that really is beyond us in some way, obviously, and then their big thing with sacrifices, you're burning something on an altar to God. Does God really need that food? Isn't God God? And who are we to say that God even has a nose, that the smell is sweet and pleasing to God? What does that mean to a divine being? So the idea here becomes that even though we still want to connect, we still need, it's not a denial of God. It's a denial of this concept of what God had been up until this point. That God is more ethereal than that and more all-inclusive, more all-encompassing, and more unknowable. And so we need to connect to God for our own benefit, and that's what prayer in a lot of ways becomes. It's what sacrifice was meant to be, but the rabbi, but there's the other piece to it is not this unknowable God, but the rabbis don't want to deny, in fact, because it's the whole foundation of their claim, is that we can know God through study of Torah, through study of the Bible, the revealed Word of God. So they have this infallible concept of the Bible, right, which I clearly don't have today. But they still had it. It was the divine word, direct word of God written through Moses, so it had to be perfect and infallible, and we studied it to learn God. Problem is, anybody who's spent any time reading the Bible realizes that there's big, huge contradictory statements in the Bible from one end to the other, depending upon where you read it. But if it's an infallible deity that wrote it, then it can't be wrong. And so the rabbis spend all kinds of time rationalizing what's in the text and finding ways to. The basic point was that there's nothing contradictory in the Torah. If there is something that seems to us as a contradiction, it's because we don't fully understand where God was coming from when it was written down, and we need to study it more. There's a lesson in there to be learned. And so they're always asking questions and always trying to learn more and understand seemingly discrepancies in the text, how it could be there to teach us something new about who we are or what we should be. There's a lot of places in it, from very simple things like in one place it says you should honor Shabbat, and in one place it says you should keep Shabbat holy, which they're not contradictory, but there's nothing in there that tells you, what does that mean? How? All right, so we're supposed to honor Shabbat, but we as humans, how are we supposed to keep the Sabbath and honor it and make it holy? And so the rabbis also have this understanding that not only is there what was written down directly, but that Moses was given an oral understanding of an oral law from God too, that allowed Moses to teach how to do what was in the Torah, and the rabbis eventually write some of that stuff down into what becomes the Talmud, this legal code that helps people understand how to be Jews and live this life of commandments that are written in the Torah, the things that we're supposed to do to be Jewish. And so beyond prayer as a connection to God, almost more important, and by the rabbi standards, is doing what it is that God says to do, even if you don't understand why. Especially, and there's a big piece of it that the doing itself will lead to the understanding. A big example is prayer, for one thing. It says that there's 3 times a day that you're supposed to pray as an Orthodox Jew, because there were 3 times a day at the temple when sacrifices were offered. Everything kind of connects back. 3 times a day you're supposed to pray as a Jew. But even if you don't understand why you're doing it, you should still go do it. In fact, there's a really great, there's a joke about a couple of rabbis standing outside Yom Kippur services, the holiest day of the year. They're out there discussing God, and one of them makes this big case that God doesn't exist. I've come to the final conclusion, this is why. It's true, God doesn't exist. I know it in my heart. Convinces his friend. I've never looked at it that way. You're so right. God doesn't exist. Very good, my friend. I'm glad you agree with me. Let's go inside and pray now. Because, and in a lot of ways, the important piece is the doing. If you spend 3 days a week praying your entire life, even if you don't understand why, I promise you, after a year, you will come up with some kind of meaning because you're doing it. Because you're doing it. The doing it in and of itself will lead you to some understanding and meaning. In many ways, because the prayer itself, even though there's a whole liturgy that we read, the words that are being said are less important than the connection. They're supposed to draw you to God, make some connection so that you can feel that presence in your life, and then that will lead you to be better in the world, right? And the more you do it, the more you practice it, the more likely you are you will find meaning. So the Torah says to be kind to love your neighbor as yourself, to try and reach out to your neighbor. We even sang the song today about love your neighbor. It was perfect, right? To love your neighbor as yourself, which is really hard to mandate. How do you force love? By being kind, by always looking out, by striving to do the right thing and to be involved in that person's life in some way. And even if you didn't like him to begin with, the fact that you're out there striving, you're going to find a reason that you're doing it. The reason will come to you. It will make you better in the end. Right? So the doing, the action, becomes more important than the actual faith in Jewish thought. That the action itself will lead you to faith is one of the more important pieces that comes out of this early text of Judaism and the rabbis. So the rabbis changed Judaism a lot, make it more about action and how we exist in the world, how we treat our neighbors especially, and this idea that anybody can come close to God by spending the time and studying the texts, finding God in your life, that it's there. This is essentially what we would call it was just Judaism at the time. It's now Orthodox Judaism as we split for a while in the last couple of hundred years. But this form in this real with this concept of God being wholly infallible and the Torah being the direct word of God exists for at least another 800 years. It's not until the Enlightenment, the whole world Enlightenment in the late 1700s to the early 1800s that things really start to change, even in the Jewish world as well. And liberal offshoots start to formulate because for the same reason that everybody else is excited about the Enlightenment, this idea that science is going to trump superstition, that there's a truth out there that we can all know through study, which was great because that was the rabbis were talking about anyway, just studying secular knowledge as opposed to the Torah, but there's a truth out there that's important. And the Enlightenment brings people in from the cities into out of the rural communities into the cities where everybody wants to study and learn at big institutions of universities, a higher education that didn't really exist before. And this changes Judaism significantly because the rabbis now lose some of their control that they had. And interestingly enough, even though they fought for 800 years earlier to take control away from the priestly class to some extent and make it a little more diverse, 800 years later, the rabbis are the ones that have some real serious control in the communities are making all the decisions. Because what happens is, even though, so for 800 years, the Jews now live all over the world in the diaspora. They've moved all over the Middle East, up into Europe, Eastern Europe, throughout Turkey, and a bunch of other places, the diaspora of the Jews. Depending upon the country and the time period that Jews were living, sometimes they were more accepted into the society, and sometimes they were way more oppressed, as I'm sure you know and have heard about. But regardless of whether they were treated well or not, they were often still relegated to their own sections of the cities or outside the cities, to what we would call shtetls, a sort of village-sized ghettos. You know, we think of ghettos as like a tenement row of apartment buildings all on one little street in the 20s and 30s. In the early Middle Ages, it was like one little set of villages, a house where this is where all the Jews lived and congregated, because that was both where the population wanted them, and Jews themselves wanted to congregate together because of a bunch of these rules, and they only liked to deal with one another. But it also gave the rabbis of the community a lot of power, because if you weren't behaving the way he felt like you weren't behaving as good a Jew as the rabbi really felt you could literally be cut off from the community, exiled from your community, which means you couldn't get in anywhere else. You weren't treated very well by the larger secular community either anyway, so it was a real threat to be cut off, and so people towed the line. The Enlightenment changes that because, first of all, people move into the cities. They start to realize, listening to the rabbis and keeping my businesses closed on Shabbat, Saturday, when the rest of the Christian world is out doing their shopping because they're closed on Sunday, that was where you made all your money. And so they started to realize that in order to really be a part of this larger society, the people wanted to change. They didn't want to seem so different, the early Reformed Jews. They didn't want to dress so different, eat so different. They wanted to study the same things, send their kids to the schools that secular people were sending their kids to, and wanted all the benefits of this modern society. And that works initially pretty well, especially in Germany at the seat of this Enlightenment period for Reformed Judaism, because there's a lot of Christian Reformation happening in Germany as well, and the Jews are buying into that too. It works for a while, and then it fails ultimately, or starts to fail ultimately, because even in Europe, there was a sense of the truest existence of a faith, let's call it. And depending on where you were. In Italy, it was Catholicism, right? In Germany, it was Lutheranism. And in England, they had the Anglican church, and they considered that the true church. This idea that there was one church that could be sponsored by the state meant that there was probably one form of Judaism that was probably more true than the others. And the Orthodox rabbis at the time, who really had more of a lock and had been around for existence, were able to say that, no, these people aren't really Jews, and they're offshoots, and we need to legislate things against them, and they got some success in there. Except that at the same time period, anybody that was starting to feel oppressed in the old world had this whole new world to look forward to. And there was lots of immigration into the United States, this land of the free that was promising freedom of religion, especially one of the founding cores, right, is the separation of church and state. There will be no state-sponsored church, which means that any form of the religion could take off and survive and really thrive. And Reform Judaism, but liberal Judaism in general, really thrives in this country, and thrives so well that it starts to really export itself back out across the world again. And it's very similar to some of the things that the early rabbis fought for, right? This idea that there is knowledge out there that's worth struggling for, and knowing that you can reconcile that knowledge with the knowledge that's in the Bible in some way, that it is doable, especially as we've come to this understanding that the Torah is not literal. You don't take the Bible as literal, but it's stories and allegories that are meant to teach us larger lessons. So the story of Adam and Eve isn't a literal story of how life comes to exist in this world. you can then accept scientific understanding of it. But the story of Adam and Eve is a wonderful metaphor for how we become intelligent, sentient beings in this world. And so it's not a literal story of creation, but a figurative story of how we evolve as humans into a dominant species in some way. And it's a beautiful understanding of the text, and works to promote Judaism and promote a connection to the divine in a way that trying to say, no, you have to believe this unbelievable story as the basis of your faith, turns people off, right? And so this is one of the things that I think is important about this other big shift. Interestingly enough, early Reform Judaism, especially at the end of the 1800s, moves away from what we would call ritual Judaism observance. They decide that really the most important pieces of the religion are the ethics that teach us to be good to one another and strive to do better in the world around us. But all the other pieces is unnecessary. And so really early Reform Judaism is they stop keeping kosher in particular ways, eating specific foods as opposed to dressing different. They even stop calling their leaders rabbis, doctor. Having a doctorate is more important than a rabbinate. And if you had both, you were called doctor. That was what you wanted to be called. These big, long, intellectual kind of pursuits really defined early Reform Judaism. That's changed in the last 50 years or so, as there's been an understanding that we lost something by moving away from the ritual. As I said, even with ideas of prayer, the action itself is important, and it'll bring you a different connection and a different understanding or recognition of the divine and how the divine fits in your life. And so by giving up on a real Passover Seder with foods and doing the right texts and reading the right Hebrew words and making the family feel as if they've gone through the stages of the Exodus, which is what the Passover Seder is supposed to do, you've lost something that's truly connective about the peoplehood and the connection to the divine. And so we've seen a lot of this come back in Reform Judaism, both in terms of a connection to prayer, especially in Hebrew, which was tough for a lot of Jews, especially American Jews early on, as well as a connection to some rituals that are less important. Kashrut, even if a lot of Jews don't keep it in the strictest sense, no pork, no shellfish, no mixing of milks and meat, there's a bunch of other things, they'll keep it in certain places, either at their house, or they're not going to eat certain types of foods because that in and of itself brings a connection to. So when you talk about how you live Judaism today, it's a very ethereal thing, right? For somebody who's been connected to Judaism their entire life or really finds it, it shows up it should show up every day. It should show up all the time. It should be something you're thinking about in your life, every moment of your life, trying to see how should I approach this moment as the Jew I want to be, in terms of how I treat the people around me, or the foods that I eat, or the charities that I give to, or all kinds of things in our life. This is how we live Judaism. And some people, it's going to services and showing up for prayer on the big holidays, or it's not coming to certain holidays. It sort of depends on, in the liberal world, as you probably know, people make decisions for themselves about what's meaningful. And that's no different for Reform Judaism today as well, although what most of us would argue, what rabbis would argue, ultimately, is that in order to make the best decisions, you really have to know what the choices are. That you should have tried prayer regularly 3 days a week for a good long time to see if it's meaningful. You can't just decide willy-nilly that it's not meaningful if you haven't tried it. Same thing with holiday observances or kashrut or study, because one of the most important pieces of Judaism always has been study. That you spend the time studying, and the studying will lead you to the action. If you know what it is that God expects of you, you're going to want to perform those things to make it happen. And if you don't spend the time knowing, then you're never even going to have an opportunity. You're never going to have the chance to reach that level. And then that would be sad. And that's a major lesson underlying Judaism today as well. What else? The last thing, I guess the last thing to kind of understand is that even though there's a lot of different I could probably list off 20 different Jewish groups that all fit within the moniker of Judaism in some way. Regardless of the group, there are a few real similarities that fit Judaism. One is this idea of monotheism, a connection of one. There is one divine being, entity, power. I can't define it more than that. It can be a very ethereal thing. It can, for some people, a connection to nature in some way that binds all of life and all of the universe together. And it can be, for some Jews, a very specific being that's intelligent and running the entire universe, but still is this all-powerful one entity, unique and whole in some way. The larger piece is an idea of a messianic world. Now, for Orthodox Jews, that's the claim of a Messiah, that there will be a particular individual that will usher in this wonderful age that the Orthodox world is still waiting for. The liberal world talks about the age as if it's a vision that we should all be striving for. That the Messianic age is the ultimate goal of a life of Judaism, of a life of God, and that we bring that about by in our own way bringing God into this world. That we try to emulate what God was. The creation is purposefully unfinished, and that we are God's partners in completing the work of creation and bringing about that vision. And that's our role in this world. And it doesn't matter which part of Judaism you are, that those two core pieces, this idea that we have a role to play in the better world, and that better world is this vision of this one God, are true cores of any stream of Judaism that you would talk about. Okay, I think that's a lot. So I think I will stop here. But thank you all so much for inviting me. This was fun for me.
Walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. Walk a mile. Walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. Walk a mile. Walk a mile in your neighbor's shoes. You'll understand them better if you do. Walk a mile.